Welcome back to part 2 of our series, Ain't I a Woman? Today, we will be chatting to Dr. Jennifer Gunter, a Canadian-American gynecologist, New York Times columnist covering women's health, and author of the international bestseller Menopause Manifesto, as well as Vagina Bible, and a specialist in chronic pain medicine and vulvovaginal disorders. Now, Jen Gunter describes herself as being on a mission to correct the misinformation and disinformation that infects our online medical resources. She is also known as the resident Twitter gynecologist and advocates for more responsible health coverage by the news, media, and less weight being given to health advice from celebrities, and also for doctors to communicate better with their patients. So we'll be chatting to her about some menopause myths and her opinion as to why women become invisible after the menopause. Enjoy. All right, so tell us all a bit more about you.
Well, I'm Dr. Jen Gunter. I'm an OBGYN. I'm originally from Canada, where I trained, and now I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm also an author and somebody who spends a lot of time on social media correcting disinformation.
Absolutely. I love that. And I think one of my favorites, you have a pinned tweet on your social media, come for the science, stay for the sex, come for the sex, stay for the science. I absolutely love that. Could you tell us a bit more about that tweet? Because I saw that and I thought, okay, follow times 1,000. Tell us a bit about that.
I can't remember if that was in response to something or if it was just some sort of nascent thought that popped into my head. I actually can't remember. I think that I was probably, reading something about, something that made me annoyed. That's usually when I have my most inspirational work, is when I'm angry because of something I've read online and it gets the creative juices going. Yeah, I think it was a bit more about why you should be, following someone who's interested in giving you good information. And so I think it kind of came from that, but it had such a positive response to it. That's why I made it the pinned tweet.
Absolutely. It's a very, very, very great one. And so, you are obviously, an expert in this space, and you advocate in very different ways, with your clinical knowledge, but also with your creative content knowledge on various platforms, and your books as well, which are just absolutely amazing and, international bestsellers. What does menopause mean to you, and why do you advocate for this issue?
Well, menopause is just another phase of your medical life, if you want to think about it that way, in the sense that, being a child is part of your medical life. You go through puberty, then your, pregnancy might be part of some people's medical life. So it's a phase of your medical life. It's, and so I think that it's become so interesting to me to talk about because as an OBGYN and someone who started medical school really early, so, I was 20 when I was having my first class in medical school, I've known about my body most of my life. I can't really remember because I'm 55. It's really hard to remember what you thought when you were 15 or 16. I can't really remember a time where I didn't know how my body works. And that's obviously informed how I've lived my life. It's informed how I've responded to the negative messaging or, the false information out there. I've always basically been vaccinated against that disinformation. And so I began to realize as I became, started writing more and more and interacting more and more with people, that just really was a unique experience and that most people didn't have that. And that's how a lot of people are, I think, harmed by either societal attitudes or, disinformation they read online. And so I just decided I would try to do something about that.
Yeah, and that is so important. This concept of access to information, and so it's not just being able to access it, but actually being able to understand it and digest it, and and how is it accessed, and in whose language is it accessed. I think that's very powerful. So on the topic of language, you speak a lot about the language that's used in medicine, but in particular around menopause. And I read an interview you were doing, and you spoke about how you're basically fighting against the cultural silence of menopause and how women can prepare. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So, again, when you're training, you don't think too much about what the words mean beyond ovary means this, right? Or, menopause medically means this. But as again, I became working more and more with words as a writer, I started to really sort of take stock and think, gosh, these words have other meanings, and they can be interpreted easily in other ways. And maybe that's even how they were originally meant to. And one of the ones that bothers me the most is when people talk about menopause and they say it's a loss of ovarian function. Imagine saying that you're losing something. I mean, no one ever says about erectile dysfunction that it's a loss of penile function, right? Yeah, I always think, I always translate that into the penis. That's kind of how I translate these terms and say, would we ever talk about the penis that way? And we don't. We have a nice description, erectile dysfunction, which is a medical condition. Menopause isn't even a medical condition. It's, it's a phase of life. And so, this loss of ovarian function is really also very ageist. So it sort of suggests that something negative is happening to your body that shouldn't be happening, right? And it also ties into this whole, women only have value when they are potential breeders. Once you're no longer a potential breeder, who cares about you? And so these words like, loss of ovarian function, implies something that isn't there. And, who wants to have their body spoken about that way?
Yeah. And that feeds in very nicely to, that's why I think I picked the title of this piece, Ain't I a Woman? So challenging what does it mean to be a woman? What does female mean in comparison to masculine and these narratives? And I guess my question is, why do you think, women disappear after the menopause?
Well, I think that, to be a woman is to be marginalized. And there's obviously greater degrees of marginalization depending on, societal structure, right? Which is usually patriarchal. So,
Patriarchy.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think it's really important that people understand that, your womanhood really has nothing to do with your ovaries or your reproductive potential. Women have their ovaries removed because of cancer. They're still women. Trans women are women. So, having ovaries is nothing to do with being a woman. It's, how you feel about yourself and how you feel about your position, I think, in the world. And so, I just think that's why it's really important to, to sort of say, look, there are medical things that can happen with menopause, and just like there's medical things that can happen in pregnancy, but nobody would say that, well, pregnancy is then a disease state because you can get nauseous, right? No, that's why we have modern medicine. Something's happening to your body. We have modern medicine. Let's see if we can help it. I mean, that's, so I like to think about it in those terms.
And that makes sense. And I wish everybody would think about it in those terms. And this is why what you do is so important in terms of breaking down barriers in terms of language and access to information and just challenging the status quo and, the patriarchal systems that hold these things like back and behind. Now, I've got an odd question. What is the funniest menopause myth you've had to debunk?
Oh, the funniest. Well, I think it's funny because it's sad. So funny, sad in the sense, this idea that women all died before menopause historically, right? So this is very, I heard that in medical school. I still get it today when I'm, people interview me like, oh, well, isn't menopause like a modern construct that menopause only exists because women now live long enough because of modern medicine? And so I say, well, wow, has anyone ever said erectile dysfunction is a modern creation because men are now only living long enough to have it? I mean, no one would say it that way. And the thing that bothers me, so it's like funny, like really tragic funny, is that erases basically every grandmother from history, right? So if all the women were dying before menopause, how did we have grandmothers? How did anybody have a grandmother? What about all this, our literature is filled with, sort of rich stories of grandmothers. We've all heard stories about grandmothers and great grandmothers and great grannies, and, for families that, are lucky to have that type of longevity. And so that's just this complete erasure. And if you just spent a little time thinking about it and spending a little time researching it, my derision here is clearly at people in medicine, you'd see it's not true. You know, people didn't all drop dead in their late 30s. If everybody died in childbirth after their first son, we wouldn't be here. You know, if you think about if you think about infant mortality, right, before vaccines and before, you know, clean water and all these things, was 50% in the first year of life. There's no possible way evolution could have sustained all the women dying after their first delivery, because then half the babies weren't making it. You know, we would just not be here. So it just takes spending 5 minutes of thinking through the ramifications of that statement to show that it's just not possible. So that's why it's funny, like funny as in that's like really sad, especially because, you know, I've heard that from medical professionals and I still hear it today.
This is terrifying, but I have to say I've never heard that people thought women, but yeah, it's terrifying that even today people still think that we have invented menopause. That's just ridiculous.
It's part of it. So it makes menopause it's a very ageist attitude. It's a very like, and then the implication is that menopause is wrong, right? Yeah. Like, so you're in it and it's like a mistake. Like we have all this incredible data to tell us about the grandmother hypothesis that, you know, that having another pair of hands in the household who had experience, who wasn't burdened with child rearing herself, was actually useful to the grand generation. So, you know, the grandmother hypothesis is evolution, the long term. You know, I think that, you know, when we compare ourselves to most mammals die once they finish reproducing, and humans and killer whales keep on living.
Yes. There we go. Oh, thank you for sharing that. So to finish off, I wonder what key messages would you like to share with people watching this video? So in particular, you know, I don't like the term lay people, but, you know, we need language that people understand. So the general public, and then I guess policymakers and researchers in public health, because, you know, when people are not even seen, then they are not even on the agenda, their priorities, their voices are not heard. So when it comes to the menopause and women in the menopause, because there is this erasure with language, I reflecting on what the research is and the priorities in public health, it just it's not existing in the same strength and capacity. So I wonder, what key messages would you like to share with the general public, policymakers, and public health researchers around the menopause?
Well, I would say that menopause is simply a phase of life. And actually, historically in medicine, we used to think about life in phases. So I think it's fine to think about it that way. I like to think about it that way. And so it's not medically abnormal, but that doesn't mean that you might not have symptoms that are bothersome or that you have health risks that are starting, you know, in the same way that when you go through puberty, that might be a risk factor for depression, right? That doesn't mean puberty is abnormal. That means that medicine needs to study these things so we can help people who are having problems or who are having suffering. So I would say that menopause is normal, but if you have symptoms, then absolutely you should seek care, because modern medicine actually has a lot of answers for a lot of symptoms. For policymakers, I would say that the same thing. I mean, just as we've sort of expected people who are pregnant to suck it up, you know, you got to work long hours, you have almost no time off work and get back to work, all these things that we've actually shown, you know, are not good. You know, we've expected that same burden of, you know, of people in menopause. You know, if you're having hot flashes, if you're, you know, having to go to the doctor multiple times because of abnormal bleeding, right? Like irregular bleeding is a very common thing in the menopause transition. And so you might need to miss more work, right? It's not fair that, that you should sort of be using your sick time in a different way, I think, because the perpetuation of the species depends on people who have a uterus, right? Absolutely. And yet we're faced with greater health burden. So I think there has to be some kind of accommodation for that, in a sense, to sort of level the playing field, because you and I both know that, you know, if you have to miss a meeting because you've got heavy bleeding and you need to go to the doctor, that's probably gonna, you know, count against you in some way, either obvious or subtle. So I think there has to be those kind of greater discussions that the burden of reproduction falls on half the population, and we shouldn't be penalizing them in the workplace because of that. And I think that we need more funding to sort of understand exactly how people are suffering and what are the best options. We have a couple of great longitudinal studies in several countries now that are looking at following women, through the menopause transition. So we can really educate people appropriately and say, we may be suffering now, but you know what, in 3 to 4 years, things might be different. And let's talk about what we can do in the meantime. And finally, the treatments need to be affordable. In many countries, estrogen is egregiously priced, or there are very few options for people who want to choose menopausal hormonal therapy. And that's just absolutely ridiculous that it's, that it's out of the price range for a lot of people. So, that would be my soapbox.
Wow. Thank you so much for those precious gems of, knowledge, and thank you for the time. Oh,
one more thing. Can I have one more thing?
Oh, more than one. Yeah.
Okay. Menopause needs to be taught in school.
Absolutely.
This idea that we don't talk about it is wrong. But when we don't discuss it, when, kids, for example, like here in California, they start talking about the human body in grade 5. And then they get like sex ed again in grade 7. They don't really discuss menopause. And my kids had great sex education. Actually, they had to label all the parts of the clitoris. They had all.
That's impressive.
Oh yeah, they have very impressive sex education. So, but there was really no discussion about menopause. And when you don't talk about something, the implication is it's shameful or it's bad, and it should be normalized. Kids should be learning the grandmother hypothesis in grade 5 when they learn human biology.
I love that. And I absolutely agree. Yeah, we should be teaching that in schools with the general reproductive health teachings. Thank you so much for that. And I am so grateful so that you agreed to spend time with us today, because you are so busy and it's also very early where you are. It's also lovely to meet Luna, the cameo appearance.
Cameo cat.
Aww, lovely to meet you, Luna. Thank you so much for chatting to me today.